Hello everyone, this is that damn Pipsqueak bringing you a MSEM deck tech. I'm talking today about Rug Delver, um, or, as it's more commonly known here, Rug Flash. There is no actual Delver in this list, but it plays similarly to Legacy Delver, and that's where I have most of my tempo experience. So, I've jokingly called the deck that a couple of times, as seen here. Um, in terms of success stories with this deck, I top forwarded the last GP with it, and I so far have top forwarded this GP as well. It'll be a little bit awkward if this video airs either after I've won or after I've scrubbed out hard from this point, so, take this all with a grain of salt. But the other player who was on Rug Flash, Infinity Chef, in GPS, has also managed to make it to top 4. So I think that does prove the deck is more than just me. So let's do a quick deck tech. So one of the common mistakes with this is that people misunderstand what the deck is trying to be. I think a lot of Flash decks in MSEM's history have tried to be tempo decks and have ended up leaning more and more heavily control. I would point to Ruben's Bant Flash deck as an example of that, and this deck is the antithesis of it. If you look, every single card in this list, with the exception of Tamiyo and Flashing Back Rogar's Frenzy, costs 2 mana or less. It is incredibly low to the ground and incredibly efficient. You don't have any clunk, and that means that A, you're an aggro deck. You will win the game by beating your opponent to death, and you will be able to do so incredibly quickly. I have gotten turn 4 kills with this before. C, it means that your deck is also not capable of going particularly long. While there are some matchups where you need to be the control, you don't win games by sitting on a pile of removal and counter magic and just leisurely sitting there one for one-ing your opponent. You have a proactive game plan, and you need to advance it. The good news is, since this is a Rug deck, red, blue, green, your removal all doubles as reach, which is, I think, one of the deck's greatest strengths. The deck's ability to pivot from controlling the board to throw 6 points at your face, swing for 7, is insane, and definitely takes a lot of people off guard. So, this list was the list that I first piloted, and I've made a few changes since then, mostly in the sideboard. So, let's look at the more up-to-date build. The first thing you'll notice is I added a third Tamiyo, I added the third Void Flare, I maxed out on Ignition Point, and I also cut the Find Nothings. Find Nothing is a very cute card, but I would struggle to call it a good card. People can play around it, and while playing around it does still give you some upside, it's just not really where you want to be with this archetype. So, I mentioned this is a tempo deck. That means that your best hands and your best plays involve deploying threat on turn 1 or turn 2. I basically would never recommend keeping hands, if you can avoid it at least, where you have no threats. Prodigious Panya is your best turn 1 threat, even though she doesn't do anything until you hit 5 mana, other than be a 1/1 flyer. The ability to hold up turn 1 counter magic, either in the form of Cosmic Sinkhole or Spell Stutter, and then at their end step, if they haven't done anything, if they haven't played into it, you can just deploy Prodigious Panya. That's incredibly valuable. I think the thing that really holds this deck together, though, is Bounty of the Gardens. Bounty of the Gardens is basically a Ashcoat Bear. It's a 2-mana 2/2 flash creature, except when you cast it, it puts a 6-mana, like a 2-mana 4/4 flash creature into your graveyard to be flashback with Cane Dancer at a later point. Bounty of the Gardens also helps this deck scale, so while I mentioned that you don't want the game to go long, this deck does have flood mitigation tools, both in the form of Bounty of the Gardens and Rogar's Frenzy, allowing you to, in the late game, when you're low on cards and you have more mana than you really want, you can convert that into resources. You then continue to disrupt your opponent. So turn 1, Panya, turn 2, counter your spell with a Portal Fracture, turn 3, counter your spell with a Cane Dancer, flashing back the Portal Fracture, kill your creature with a Void Flare. That's the sort of gameplay you want. You will win the game if you have control over the board and your opponent can't get on it. You will also win the game if you put creatures on the board and stop your opponent from removing them. Ultimately, this is a deck that dictates what its opponent can and can't do, and you will need to be very aware of the pace of the game. Um, if your opponent is the beatdown, you can't just sit back and be purely reactive, because you will not win if that game goes long enough. Your opponent will eventually burn you out or what have you. You need to beat them to death before they can do that. So let's talk about the core of the deck. This deck was originally built on the premise of, I want to play a Cane Dancer deck that can flashback Find Nothing. Even though we've cut the Find Nothings, I think Cane Dancer is the reason why this deck is good in a lot of ways. Cane Dancer plus Bounty the Gardens is a really powerful interaction. It means that Cane Dancer can bring along another big threat. Um, it also counts as multiple spells cast for Veilborn Meddler, and Cane Dancering back a Portal Fracture is also backbreaking. Cane Dancer is also why we're playing Ignition Point. Despite the fact this deck can play almost entirely at flash speed, and thus we don't care about that second line of text on Ignition Point, the fact that Ignition Point is a blue-red burn spell means that Cane Dancer becomes a Chupacabra, or a reach creature in general. This deck, I would say, is also largely based on Cosmic Sinkhole. Force Spike is an incredibly powerful card. The issue with Force Spike is that it draws dead after the first 3 or 4 turns of the game. Cosmic Sinkhole doesn't. It gets markedly less efficient. 1 mana for 1 mana is a good trade, whereas Quench isn't, and Convolute also isn't. But the fact that it's all 3 of those cards gives it a lot of staying power. Doesn't have any synergies with Cane Dancer, which is a little bit awkward, but, you'll survive. So I would say the core of this deck is the 4 Cane Dancers, probably 3 or 4 Veilborn Meddlers. I'm not certain about that number, but the card generally shows up big. 4 Cosmic Sinkhole, 4 Portal Fracture, 4 Bounty the Gardens, and 4 Rogar's Frenzy, with the rest of these cards being what are described as flex cards. That means that in various metagames, I can see, trimming the Panyas for something else. Maybe you don't main deck the Spell Stutter. If there's not a lot of aggro or decks that play to the board, you don't need the early Void Flares to, protect yourself. Maybe Tamiyo is not the right choice in some metas. But as I'll get to in the kind of matchup section, I think that's kind of... I think a lot of those flex slots, if you start changing them too quickly, or if you say on a fundamental level, there won't be any aggro decks around for whatever reason, I think this deck stops being a good pick. So talking about the sideboard, the primary thing to note is we have 3 Still the Pandemoniums and 2 Spell Stutters. Those come in over burn spells in matchups where our burn spells aren't live. So usually the Void Flares come out first, and then some number of the Ignition Points for 5 copies of Still and 2 Spell Stutter. The Once Abandons are a concession to one of our worst matchups, which is Villainy. Having game against Artifact and Enchantment combo decks is good, and the fact this can also tag Planeswalkers like Mpumo is kind of critical, because a lot of Planeswalkers that affect the board can be really hard for our deck to deal with. The 3 Sunken Ambitions, I think, are one of the most suspect parts of this deck. I think the card is good, undoubtedly, but I also suspect it's helping a lot of our matchups that are already good. It also is possible that if counters decks continue to see less and less play, having access to this sort of effect becomes less important. This card is mostly for kind of aggressive mirrors, or generally matchups where we want to pull down on some of our counter magic and board in more board interaction. Sheldran's Rage is a fantastic card. I have a lot of fond memories with this card, and the fact that it's an instant speed board wipe that can be either 2 mana for 1 damage to everything or 4 mana to 3 damage to everything is an incredible rate, and allows you to represent a lot of things while also keeping the board in check. The Markarth Assailants are one of the weakest parts of this deck. So the good news is this deck actually loses functionally nothing from Crotation. You lose Markarth Assailant, you lose some of the lands, such as Weathered Oasis, and Mountain Spring. But that's it, and those are fairly replaceable. While you need a wide variety of land names to enable good Bounty of the Gardens and Portal Fractures, you don't need those in particular. Markarth Assailant is theoretically here to help you beat control decks because it's reach in a very difficult to interact with way. In my experience, it isn't a deciding factor in those matchups, however. So let's talk a little bit about matchups. Um, this deck is, as I mentioned, a tempo deck. It preys on lower to the ground decks, especially creature-based aggro. It shreds through. It has a really good matchup versus combo, as well as combo control. It can be good against mid-range, although that's really dependent on the type of mid-range deck they are and if you're on the play or not. This is a deck that gets substantially better on the play. I wouldn't describe it as substantially worse on the draw because you have one mana interaction, but if you're on the play, it's so hard for your opponent to get out from under you. Um, the reason this deck is good is because MSEM right now is overwhelmingly linear. If people were playing more interactive decks, this deck would struggle a lot more because I think its weakest matchups are Villainy and Hard Control. If you have cheap removal for this deck's creatures, you don't play to the board, and you have some way of going over the top if this deck can't kill you fast enough, this deck will have a harder matchup. I don't think it's like a 30-70 matchup. I haven't hit any matchup that feels that way from this deck, which is a really good sign. It means the deck is powerful. But you definitely are on the back foot in those matchups. And that's one of the reasons why the sideboard is so heavily dedicated to beating them. The other thing you'll notice is that there's not any like hate rocks in the sideboard. There's no Titan Snare. There's no like things that sit on the board and say perpetually you can't do this. You don't want those kinds of cards because they require you to tap out and they require you to proactively deploy an answer. Whereas this deck really succeeds via being able to reactively choose whether it's going to answer a thing or create a threat on any given turn. The other thing I would note about this deck's mana base is the one of Lumbering Hillock. Lumbering Hillock feels like a weird choice because, this deck is not base green. This deck is strongly blue. It has a couple of green cards, and secondary color is mostly red. But I think Lumbering Hillock is probably one of the best lands in the format in terms of utility lands, and I think playing it is very close to free. It's not in here as a land slot as much as it's in here as a spell slot that happens to be a land. And this card will win you games out of nowhere, although there are matchups where I think it's reasonable to board out. I'm not sure what other details... so the other main topic to discuss is the Crotation question. So, as I mentioned, this deck's going to lose Markarth the Assailant, but it is going to gain Solar Flare, which is a huge deal. Solar Flare is a red and a green Lightning Helix, and that will likely take the place of some number of the Ignition points in the main deck, and maybe one copy in the sideboard, and that will take this deck's aggro matchup from being good to very, very good. I'm not going to say unlosable because I don't think those matchups exist in Magic, but in general, this deck is acquiring, I think, less from New Horizons than you'd think, but on the other hand, it's losing very little from the May Madness update and from Crow sets leaving the format. I would recommend playing this deck into any meta where you think people are going to continue to be linear. It looks like Horizons might change that, might not. And that's where I'm going to bring it back around to an earlier point I made, which is I think you might look at this deck and say, ooh, I think it's very easy to look at this deck and play this sort of deck, and when you hit your bad matchups, you hit something like Villainy, you hit something like Hard Control, you want to make changes to the main deck. You want to say, like, this deck has way too much burn, it's really bad against those style of decks, I want more things that can counter their things before they come down, etc. I think that is fundamentally misunderstanding this deck's role in the metagame. This deck preys on linear decks and non-interactive decks. And as long as those decks are a major force in MSEM, I would recommend this deck because it doesn't stomp them, but I'm now 8-1 in Swiss style events with this, as well as 5-0 from leagues. So it's clearly got a lot going for it. This deck is very forgiving for some types of mistakes and very unforgiving for others. If you are bad at knowing when you need to answer threats versus when you can let them sit around, I would not recommend this deck. But on the other hand, this deck is powerful enough that I have made pretty costly misplays, and this deck has still pulled me out of it. If you think the meta is going to start being slower, if people are playing more efficient removal, if people are playing bigger threats that you can't burn away and that they can't have them be countered for some reason. Keen's Devoted leaving the form, it's good for this deck. If that's the case, I think this deck slowly stops being a good idea if your creature's going to be reliably brick-walled. So I would recommend not making this deck into something it isn't. Don't cut your cheap cards to put in more expensive cards, and yeah, just know why you're playing this deck when you play it, but I would highly recommend people do so because it's a really powerful deck, and I also enjoy playing it a lot. So thank you all for watching this video. Hopefully I didn't drone on too much, and hope everyone here has a great day.